Hello, my name is Brian, and this is our presentation on the labor shortage. First of all, I will be introducing the labor shortage and describing some effects. And then Adrian will be talking about some solutions to it. And then Daniel and Evan will talk about some course concepts and how they apply to the labor shortage. And finally, Nate will wrap us up with the conclusion. All right, so the first thing we have to ask is, why is there a labor shortage in the first place? And the simple answer is COVID-19. When the pandemic hit, there was a very quick impact of millions of Americans being unable to go to their jobs. A big reason for this is that many businesses either had to change how they operated or could not operate at all under the quarantine, which meant that very few workers, if any, were necessary to come to work, and there were tons of layoffs. Additionally, any employees who actually came down with COVID couldn't work no matter what. And then during this time, there was a raise in unemployment benefits and stimulus checks for relief. And that meant that many Americans didn't need to come to work anymore, even as quarantine started to lift and jobs became available. And then another effect that has remained even as jobs have become available again is that businesses are less inclined to rehire workers, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But the main effect is that even today, 2 years later, the labor shortage is still affecting companies around the nation. So in the last slide, I mentioned some ongoing effects as a result of the labor crisis. And one of the big ones was that when all these Americans lost their job, relief came in, and unemployment benefits were greatly increased to help families and citizens in need. And then because these benefits were so effective now, many Americans were able to retain the income they were making from their jobs or even make more money. And so that meant when jobs were open again and people could go back to work, a lot of people decided they didn't need to or didn't want to, simply because the unemployment relief enabled them to live without needing work. So some state governments have tried to lower unemployment benefits to get people to come back, but this hasn't been entirely effective. And so a result of this is that employees have a lot more power than they used to. They can demand higher wages and better conditions because their employers need them. And that impacts whether or not employers are hiring more employees or seeking other alternatives, which we'll explore a bit later.
So providing a solution to some of the problems that we outlined in the paper as well as earlier in the slides, we can see that higher wages and increased labor costs has mainly been something experienced on lower end jobs, particularly minimum wage type jobs. This is because, well, essentially a solution is that higher wages is going to make up the difference in terms of the increased stressors from the pandemic, as well as people kind of realizing that work isn't necessarily everything. So this leads to higher costs of direct labor. So that's kind of the trade-off of this. But as for companies that do rely on cheap labor, big retailers such as Walmart, this can definitely jeopardize their profits, as cheap labor is one of the hallmarks of their business. One solution to avoiding the rising increase in labor costs is to transition from a labor force to a fully automated one. So some downsides to this is that automation is fairly expensive, but as labor prices increase, the difference between the two tends to decrease. So this also gives retailers and manufacturers a little bit more leeway in terms of the efficiency and being able to customize the supply chains as well. And outsourcing does avoid the rise in domestic wages. That's another kind of solution to this, is outsourcing the labor. Instead of having it done here where wages are now going up due to the pandemic, they can shift it to a country that pays a lot less. Another downside to this, so, is it does increase transportation costs, having to ship it from one country to the other.
Some of the class concepts that tie into this problem are production costs and capacity constraints. A capacity constrained process is a process whose demand is higher than its process capacity. Process capacity is determined by the capacity of the bottleneck in the process. Rising wages increases the cost of labor in any process, which increases overall production costs. A product of this rising cost of labor is that companies will be either unwilling or unable to scale up production in certain steps of their process. As a result, their process capacity will not be able to keep up with their demand. This causes the process to become capacity constrained. This capacity constraint, combined with rising costs of labor domestically, encourages companies to either automate or outsource steps in their process so they can focus current workers on the bottleneck step. That ties into the next class concepts relevant in this problem: line balancing and resource utilization. Line balancing is the process of shifting tasks and laborers from one station to another in order to bring the total processing time of every step closer to the takt time of the process, thereby bringing process capacity closer to demand. Resource utilization is the measure of how much uptime each resource in a process has compared to the total cycle time of the process. With less labor available, companies will find it harder to line balance their processes. If line balancing becomes impossible, resource utilization cannot be improved, meaning laborers have more downtime at each step, resulting in wasted wages. Inability to line balance also leads to decreased flow rates, as the inefficient bottleneck slows down the entire process. Once again, outsourcing the automation can help by relieving some of the duties of the laborers, allowing them to focus more on relieving the bottleneck.
As the different problems and solutions to the labor shortage present themselves, outsourcing production has proven to be a very attractive option. Companies in the US can outsource their processes, which were once done domestically, to overseas companies and have the goods shipped to the US. This is an alternative to the higher wages they would have to pay, and it's a way to reduce the need for the low-end jobs that companies are struggling to find. It reduces the need for labor, which complements an environment in which there is less labor available at the expense of introducing transportation costs to the company's business practices. Speaking of which, the primary downside it presents is the concept of lead time. Lead time is defined as the total time required to complete a process from start to finish. And the issue with outsourcing is that it introduces transportation. The need to ship goods greatly adds to lead time, substituting avoided labor costs with transportation costs. In many cases, the higher lead time needed to outsource can result in a situation where even though overseas labor can fulfill demand and be much cheaper than domestic labor, it may still be cheaper to produce domestically. As such, outsourcing can never be perceived as a default answer to the labor shortage crisis and must be carefully considered in context of its own unique costs.
So what is the best choice? Well, in situations where rising labor wages aren't a crucial issue, companies can rehire workers and issue line balancing to maximize effectiveness of the workers they have. Also, while transportation costs can be kept low, outsourcing can avoid the rising costs of labor. When lead time is a crucial factor, automation can also circumvent labor while keeping production timely. Each business must examine their own scenario to make the best decision for themselves.